Francie Marbury. I'm on the CASP board, Community Asylum Search Project, currently serving as the chair of the board. And want to welcome you to CASP's workshop on immigration and the new administration. Sort of feel like, here we go again. And what I flashed back on as I was thinking about preparing for this was 2018, when many of the people here in this room were at the Brattleboro Common and just expressing outrage about separation of families down at the border and the policies that the Trump administration was implementing at that time. And the thing that seems really different to me now is we've been there. You know, we sort of know what may be coming down the pipe. We don't know everything, and we told me some pleasant surprises, but we have the dubious opportunity to prepare. There are many people and organizations that are helping make today possible, but I would particularly like to recognize and appreciate Kristen Sullivan, who's the executive director of the retreat farm. Kristen, waving back there, here with us this morning. So please, join me in thanking Kristen. Making it possible for us to be here. I'd also like to recognize the reformer, who's done a wonderful job of getting out PR around this organization, around this workshop, and sponsoring us, and the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation, which has also been sponsoring us. Alex Beck is here this morning, waving from the back, and he will be sharing some thoughts with us. Is there anyone from the reformer here, out of curiosity? Okay, not right now, but really, they did a great job with the article and the PR.
And Beth, and Emma from Beth.
Oh, thank you. And Emma from Beth. I sure didn't have you to do that introduction. But now I know Emma's last name, Emma Maddox. So that's important. So just very quick overview. I'm going to turn it over to Liv Barrelson, the executive director of CASP, in just a second. She will introduce CASP's work and introduce Emma, who is sort of our main speaker today. And then after that, we will have Alex come up and join us up front too, and have sort of a panel opportunity for your questions. I don't know how many answers we're going to have this morning, but we're certainly going to be coming up with some ideas for way forward and way that we as a community can continue to support both asylum seekers and other vulnerable populations. Okay, and then we'll wrap it up at the end. There are lots of nice refreshments in the back. Please take advantage of those. Okay, I'll start talking.
My name is Liv Wilson. I'm the executive director of CASP, the Community Asylum Seekers Project, and I am introducing Emma from DAP. She is an attorney with the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project, and we have a couple of clients in common. And we are doing a Know Your Rights training today. So just a brief intro of CASP. We are Southern Vermont based. We provide legal and social services to asylum seekers in the Southern Vermont area. We also partner with the statewide coalition that provides similar services and organizations like RAP, BDCC, CDC, et cetera, to help support asylum seekers in this region. Organizations do Know Your Rights trainings like these to help people understand, assess, and navigate risk, both those who might be facing risk and those who might be assisting individuals facing risk, to help hold authorities accountable for violations of rights and other things that are owed to communities that are potentially at risk, to inform and empower people in communities and create change and set precedents. Okay, so things to expect under Trump 2.0. I think I should start off actually by addressing maybe the last point on this slide, which is just that there's a lot of uncertainty. I think to a degree, we know to expect some repetition of prior policies, but there is definitely a lot of uncertainty right now about how those policies might be expanded, and other things that we might see as we look ahead to arguably a more prepared administration than the last time. So some things that we're sort of expecting to see off the bat are high-profile enforcement actions,
an example of that would be like a publicized workplace raid on a farm or other place that employs a large number of migrant immigrant workers. We're expecting to see pretty quickly the halting of refugee admissions to the United States. An example of that being putting in place another Muslim ban, like we saw last time, with an extension to more countries than we saw last time. A way that we're definitely concerned that this might impact Vermont communities and Brattleboro communities is that we're expecting to see a stopping of the flights that are currently coming from Pakistan of Afghan individuals into the United States. So we're expecting to see a halt in family reunification practices in that way, which is definitely concerning and kind of something to think about, but a reality to sort of prepare for how you can head with. We're expecting to see a decreased border flow, though I will say right now the border flow is already quite decreased with the use of the Customs and Border Protection 1 app and Remain in Mexico policy. There's actually already been significant border flow decrease, but expecting to see that continue, if not become even more decreased. Decreased humanitarian protections, one of the sort of explicit powers of the executive branch, as underlined by the Supreme Court in a variety of cases, is the power to control who is within the United States, how they enter the United States, and if they're allowed to stay, and what protections are afforded them during those times. So we have concerns about what that's going to look like moving forward. Expanded expedited removal proceedings, meaning that individuals are unlikely to, unless they're able to claim an asylum protection or similar protection upfront and quickly, are likely to be placed in expedited proceedings where they are not getting what we would sort of consider traditional due process, and an increase in detentions. There are few to no restrictions on the detaining of asylum seekers during the pendency of their proceedings. So there's definitely concern that both for asylum seekers and seekers of other status will see in detentions. In previous administrations, detaining such individuals was considered a very low priority if they didn't have criminal convictions or other reasons for the detention of those individuals. We expect to see the reasons and rationales for detaining individuals with independency of their proceedings. We're expecting to see an expansion of the rationales of individuals during proceedings. Reinstatement of matter of AB and similar cases. This refers to a number of cases that were decided by Jeff Sessions and then sort of reversed by Garland, and that have been sort of flip-flopped back and forth on what we consider to be particularized social groups for the cases for the sake of claiming asylum. And a couple of groups who have seen sort of this flip-flopping back and forth of like, yes, this can be a valid asylum claim, no, this cannot be a valid asylum claim, are women who have undergone domestic violence under the Trump administration. It was a fairly hard line. No, we do not consider this to be a particular enough social group for folks to come to the United States and claim asylum based on domestic violence within their country sort of being normalized. And then that was reversed, and we're expecting to see that probably reversed again. And similarly, we're expecting to see that cases based on gang-based violence and narco-based violence are going to be less and less accepted under this upcoming administration. Again, those are ones that there was sort of a hard rejection of and then a loosening of, and we're expecting to see a fairly hard rejection of that. And we're also expecting to see pressure on states and cities that don't comply with executive branch's enforcement policies. There's been sort of already some like murmurs and threats of withdrawing federal funding from cities and states that declare themselves sanctuary cities and states. And we're definitely expecting to see some examples made pretty early on in terms of withdrawing federal funding and federal aid from infrastructure projects and things of that nature to try to discourage sanctuary city and state policies. We're expecting to see changes in priority memos. Priority memos right now outline who is a detention and deportation priority for ICE and Border Patrol agents. And who isn't, and we're expecting to see the category of who isn't should shrink quite a bit. And then hardline executive actions, what we mean by that is that on January 20th, we're expecting to see a number of measures signed into law through executive action on that day. Similar to what happened last time, we're expecting that one of them will be an announced Muslim ban, as I referenced earlier, and that will probably see additional executive action taken as well, such as the immediate stopping of flights out of areas like Pakistan and other areas where we receive refugees from. And then we're expecting to see decreasing in USCIS funding and staffing. We've already seen some of that in Vermont recently. One of the USCIS service centers had layoffs of about half the staff. They're expecting that to drop even lower to about only 70 staffers later this year, with at this point only rumors that the office might be shut down entirely. And so that's likely to increase wait time for things like application processing, employment authorization documents, etc. I think I've already addressed the uncertainty a bit, and you probably all now feel like panic and uncertainty after that list of things I just presented you with. So that's where we're at right now. With that, I'll go to the next slide. Okay. So then something to address up front is who's most likely to be at increased risk. The Trump administration has already, or the upcoming Trump administration has already put forth that immigrants with criminal history are going to be at sort of the greatest and most immediate risk, that there's an intent to detain anyone who might not be currently detained and deport swiftly anyone who has any criminal record, which is out of sync with prior enforcement policies that were particularly directed towards felons towards violent felonies specifically. And then undocumented immigrants will also be at increased risk. One of the sort of safest ways to protect yourself against deportation if you're stopped by ICE, by CBP, by someone else, is to be able to provide a document showing that you either have status or pending status. Undocumented immigrants are fairly likely to be placed into expedited removal proceedings with the hope of removing those individuals before they can claim something like asylum status or another status that might offer them that level of protection. And then something else that I'll touch on a little bit later, more broadly, is mixed status households. Something that we're currently preparing individuals for is the fact that we're likely to see U.S. citizen children of undocumented parents potentially separated from those parents if they face deportation. It's really scary. It happened last time. It's fairly likely to happen again. There are certain ways to protect that. I'll touch on that in later slides. Or not to protect against it, but to put protections in place for if and when that occurs. And then greater obstacles. So we're unlikely to see just the, say, complete stripping and immediate deportation of asylum seekers or immigrants with temporary status, but they're likely to see greater obstacles and some procedural changes under the upcoming administration. Individuals with temporary status are unlikely to see that status renewed. So we've already seen, for example, that TPS was halted for a number of countries. Other countries on that list are also likely to see those programs stopped. So they'll be ineligible for renewal. And then for asylum seekers, like we've already touched upon a bit, there's going to be an increased risk that there will be detention during the pendency of proceedings. And there are concerns about violations of the already somewhat limited due process that is available to asylum seekers in our current court and administrative systems. Slide, please. Alrighty. And then just sort of so that we're all on the same page as we talk about things. There's a difference between asylum seekers and capital R refugees, and then lowercase r refugees. And so I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit, which is that in its broadest sense, a refugee is any individual who is fleeing a country of origin based on persecution in that country. However, there's also a specific legal definition of refugee, which is what we mean by refugee capital R. And that refers specifically to someone who's been pre-vetted by an international organization, such as the United Nations, often because they are within a refugee camp, and then given referral to the US government or other governments, but of course we're talking about the US government for us, for an extended vetting process. And so they arrive within the country that they're seeking refuge in with baseline status and baseline vetting already. They're eligible to receive government-funded resettlement and case management, and are able to work immediately upon arrival. For asylum seekers who arrive without this pre-vetting process, for whom that happens once they're already within the United States, there are fewer resources available. There's a higher risk of detention and removal. There is no government-funded resettlement and case management. And these individuals are not eligible to work upon arrival. They have to wait for a minimum of 6 months after filing their asylum claim to be able to then file for an employment authorization document and then be able to work. So as you can see by saying it's 6 months until filing, then approval, that process can take well over a year. It's why often asylum seekers are stuck in a really difficult place of needing to take work sort of under the table, because it's just not realistic to say you're not eligible for any resettlement funding or assistance, and also you can't work for a year. Best of luck. So that opens up a lot of vulnerabilities for asylum seekers. You can.
I just wanted to highlight quickly, we're going to be doing employee rights trainings in conjunction with ECDC, but we want to do this specifically about asylum seekers because refugees are not at a higher risk of deportation under the Trump administration yet with the current on the books. So this is really an issue that is going to be targeting undocumented immigrants and to some degree asylum seekers.
And so I think it's also important to quickly talk about the difference between immigration and criminal systems. And one of the reasons for that is, though I would say that most of the clients that I work with would speculate that detention and deportation are no less severe to them than being arrested than a criminal process by the United States government. They're not considered one and the same. Detention and deportation under the immigration system is considered civil enforcement. It's not considered criminal enforcement, and deportation is not recognized as punishment. The Supreme Court in 1893 said that deportation is a civil consequence rather than a criminal punishment. The Supreme Court since then has softened the tiniest bit in that regard, and has stated that they recognize, because of the effect that it can have on families and individuals, that it is something more than a civil consequence, but it is still something less than a criminal penalty. So practically speaking, this means that criminal defendants are given increased rights and the sort of like due process rights that we might hope to see afforded to everyone are not necessarily afforded to immigrants. For example, there is no right to an attorney in the immigration system, and there's a huge difference in the success of immigration case for a represented individual versus an unrepresented individual. And immigration courts and immigration enforcement don't have guidelines that are sort of as stringent in terms of the rights that are afforded to those under their system as those going through our criminal legal system. Okay, and that next slide. Okay, so Fourth Amendment rights. That being said, under both systems, you do have Fourth Amendment rights. Anyone physically present in the United States is afforded those rights. States are afforded Fourth Amendment rights through the Fourth Amendment itself. If you're ever interested in the Constitution, there is a way to think about what rights are afforded to states and what rights are afforded to people. And we call those above the line and below the line rights. I find it useful to think about them that way. So things above the line are the rights that are afforded to states that say a state has a right to this sort of protection or has a right to protect its citizens in X way. And then rights that are afforded to people are called, we call them below the line rights, colloquially. And those are rights that are afforded to people through the 14th Amendment that say like these above the line rights are also applicable to individuals, not just states, through the wording of the 14th Amendment. So practically what this means for the Fourth Amendment is that the Fourth Amendment protects states from unreasonable searches and seizures by the federal government. It's the way in which if, say, ICE comes to a sheriff's office and says, we want to see all of the files of everyone within your office because we want to see if any of them are undocumented, for example. The sheriff can say, no, get out of my office. Where's your warrant? Similarly, as it's applied to individuals, people are also protected from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. And this is, again, anyone who's physically present within the United States. So how it applies to you depends on exactly where you are. You have sort of the most protections if you're in your home, slightly fewer if you're in a car or in public, and I'll discuss that a little more in further slides. But it's important to remember that there are these, that Fourth Amendment rights are still applicable, even though some rights, as I discussed previously, such as due process rights, are different dependent on status. Okay, next slide, please. So, starting with that, what if ICE comes to my home? Without a judicial warrant, ICE can't do anything that your neighbor can't do without your consent. So ICE or a neighbor could knock on your door. Sure. They can ask to come in and they cannot enter without your consent. Hopefully, I don't really know what your relationships are like with your neighbors, but I hope that they're not just entering your home all the time. And so if ICE shows up at an individual's house without a judicial warrant and asks to come in, the best advice that I can give is say no. Ask to see a judicial warrant. If there's not one present, say no. And I think on the next slide, we have some examples of what an administrative warrant and judicial warrant are. Okay, great. So administrative warrant will be signed by an officer and not a judge. So if an officer shows up and says, here's my warrant signed by me, no, leave. If the and if someone shows up with a judicial warrant, on the other hand, signed by a judge or a magistrate, then they do have a right to enter one's home. A judicial warrant will also need to specify the name of the court and the scope of the warrant, and is based on commission of a crime, again, whereas immigration offenses are civil violations. So if someone arrives with an administrative warrant for an immigration offense or civil violation that says it's for the arrest of a, quote, alien, or authorizes an immigration officer through the Immigration and Nationality Act, again, those are administrative, they are not judicial. You do not then have to provide access to your home to the officer at the door. If someone does come in with a judicial warrant, I think it's really important to focus on the line that says it specifies the scope of the warrant. You do not need to provide access to anything that is not in the scope of that warrant. If the warrant is to be able to enter and speak with one individual, that individual should be the only person who is interacting with law enforcement. If there are 5 people in the home, 4 of those people don't need to do anything. If it specifies that someone is able to enter the house and look for a specific document, provide that document straight away and say, no, you cannot look through the rest of the house. Making sure diligently protecting rights includes like knowing exactly what is being asked for, and asking for clarity on that. So, for example, if you're being presented with a warrant that you cannot read, that is not in the language that you read, asking for interpretation and clarity is something that you can invoke as well. Next slide. And these are just examples of what these things look like. So you can see here the difference between you've got U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Department of Homeland Security up here versus a judicial warrant, which will be specifically from a court.
Can I just ask, are we going to be able to send out this PowerPoint to participants afterwards?
Yeah.
Great, okay.
Yes. That was a yes. Alrighty. So moving along with what advice comes to my home. You should speak to them through your door, and you do not need to open the door. You also should not say much. So ask who they are and why they're there. If they have a judicial warrant, or say that they do, ask them to slide it under the door or show it to you through a keyhole or a window. Look at it carefully, verify that it is actually a judicial warrant. Very unfortunately, our courts have given broad deference to the idea that it's fine for officials to lie to people. So making sure that you're ocularly verifying that something is actually a judicial warrant rather than relying on the veracity of the information being given to you by someone orally is important. If the individuals present do not have a judicial warrant, you can ask them to leave your property. If they do have a judicial warrant, as I went over earlier, you can allow them to enter and search for the person specifically listed, but they do not need to look at anything else. You should not say anything besides, I'm exercising my right to stay silent and I wish to speak with a lawyer. Sign anything or present any documentation or identification from another country, again, unless something is specifically listed on a warrant, or lie or produce false documents. Things get a little more dicey when you get into what if I've stopped while driving, particularly within the 100-mile border zone, which I'll cover a little bit more in a few slides. That said, if you're stopped while driving, first step is still the same. You ask who is stopping you and for what reason. If that individual is ICE or a CBP agent, then you present a copy of your immigration papers if you have them with you. Don't give away your originals. That can be a huge problem. As an attorney, one of the most frustrating things that I see at times is when someone has had their paperwork and their identity documents stripped from them, and then I'm attempting to help them apply for status that they're eligible for, but part of what's required by the government is providing them a copy of documents that they no longer have because someone has taken them from them. So always, 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 documents that are carried should be copies of the documents. Originals should ideally be kept in a lockbox or other safe location. And then ask them to free to go. You should not show ID from your countries of origin, show originals, hand them a phone with photos of ID and immigration documents, because once an open phone is handed to a CBP or a member of law enforcement, they have the right to access anything that is on that phone. That, I should mention, is true for all of us, regardless of immigration status. Fun tip, don't give people your unlocked phone. And you also should not speed away and give a reason to arrest you for a traffic violation. I want to say I know that seems really obvious, but I also completely understand like the kind of fear that would lead someone to do that. I think that like that is a very valid fear, but trying to like breathe, get out of that sort of immediate panic and recognize that that could lead to further and far more severe problems down the line, is really critical, even in these sort of like heightened anxiety situations.
I put that in there because I had a client do it once. So.
Oh, I've seen it too. And again, I get it, but and if you're stopped by police for a traffic violation rather than by ICE or CBP, if you have access to it, you should provide a Vermont or United States ID rather than your immigration paperwork. You should not drive without a valid license and identification. This can adversely impact your immigration case. I have a number of clients who are going through simultaneous immigration and criminal proceedings as a result of a traffic violation, including like driving on a suspended license or driving without a license. It's incredibly difficult in Vermont to get around without a car. And I completely recognize that reality. However, it can really, really complicate immigration proceedings. So as much as is possible, making sure to walk, take public transit, get rides with people who have valid documentation, and try to work towards valid driving documentation before getting behind the wheel with cars. Really, really important. You do not have to tell police your immigration status. Remember that. Yes.
What if they ask?
You can say, why are you asking? Or I don't wish to divulge that at this time, or I'm reserving my right not to mention that. And you can always say, I don't wish to answer these questions until I'm able to speak with an attorney. Again, while there's not that same right in immigration cases, once it becomes a traffic violation, once it becomes something that is in the criminal system, you have a right not to say anything until you've spoken with an attorney. So yeah, hope that's helpful. And then next slide, please. Another reason why this can get a little dicier when it comes to traffic stops, specifically within the state of Vermont, is that there's this 100-mile border zone. A majority of Vermont, though not Brattleboro, is within that 100-mile border zone in which ICE and CBP have enhanced enforcement capacities. Fun fact also, because most of the major cities within the United States are within the 100-mile border zone, since it goes like all the way around the country, 2 out of 3 people living within the United States live within that 100-mile border zone, even though it is a minority of the country. I just think is an interesting fact. This enhanced enforcement capacity allows for the warrantless boarding and searching of aircrafts and boats, as well as warrantless searches of cars. Immigration papers can be demanded without a warrant while operating within those zones. Again, when on an aircraft, boat, bus, or when stopping someone within their car, still does not apply to someone showing up at your house without a warrant. You still have the right to remain silent or state that you will only answer questions in the presence of an attorney, unless, and this is important, you have a temporary legal status, such as an F1 visa, like a student visa, a work visa, etc., in which case you must divulge that status as part of having said visa. Additionally, if you have a valid immigration document, such as a document that states that you've received asylum status and you're over the age of 18, you must present that document when asked. You still have protection against warrantless searches of your belongings without probable cause. So if someone says, let me search your purse, let me search your house, why? And you have protection against detention without reasonable suspicion. So again, why am I being stopped? Am I being detained? Asking those 2 questions repeatedly, very helpful, particularly am I being detained? And reasonable suspicion and probable cause, very specifically, what someone looks like, their language in which they are speaking, and and race and nationality are not enough to rise to probable cause or reasonable suspicion, asterisk at this time. The question was, what about asylum seekers who have court dates? There's a difference between asylum status and asylum seeking status. That's a really good question. If someone is still in the process of seeking asylum but hasn't actually been granted asylum, they won't have any paperwork to show. The document that you need to show is if your asylum has been approved and you have a document that states that you have status as an asylee. That is a document that you're required to show. That's really good clarification. Thank you. Was there another question?
Imagining if I was stopped by a police and there's that tension, there's that anxiety, how am I going to really confront a police who's gonna have a power? There's a power thing there. I mean, I imagine it's very hard to hold your own, even though despite all this advice. Can you give examples of what's happened? Can they still search your purse? Can they still, you know, what actually happens?
Yeah, so for Zoom, the question that was asked was about sort of the power disparity with police officers and immigration enforcement and someone who is stopped, and the reality of what's being asked and what can happen, which is a really good question. And I think like the answer to that is yeah, there's going to be a lot of anxiety. There absolutely is a large power disparity there. That said, the only way to protect one's rights is to enforce them, is to call them out on your own. And in terms of confrontation, I guess the way that I kind of think about it is that you don't necessarily have to confront the police officer or law enforcement. It's more about shutting down than about confronting. It's more about saying, no, right? I want to search your purse. No, I don't give my consent. And I think it's really hard, but I think getting practiced in those no's is something that can be important. I mean, I have clients with which I run scenarios, for example, like, okay, right now, I'm not Emma. Right now, I'm stopping you on a highway. I'm stopping you at a checkpoint. I'm asking you for these things. What do you say in response to me? And I think that can be really helpful. And so I think the answer is that anxiety is going to be there, and that the more practice you can get in saying no, the better. And then also just like having awareness of where the lines are, right? So if you're within the 100-mile border zone, your car can be checked, but you can still say no to your purse. Like,
I guess my question is,
yeah.
I hear you, and it is a challenge. Of course, my question is, are there ever cases where the policeman will still say, give me a person?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then what happens?
You keep saying no.
And then?
Are
Are there ever cases where the policeman, for one reason or another, does not accept no?
So absolutely. There are cases where, for example, someone just takes the purse and looks through it. In that case, an attorney could help pursue a violation of that person's rights. Provided they have access to an attorney, which, as we have talked about, is a little complex based on whether this is a stop and detention by criminal law enforcement or by, quote, civil and administrative immigration enforcement. Yeah.
And then I'll also add, and then we're going to do Q&A at the end, so that'll be the last part for this question. But it definitely does happen that law enforcement doesn't take no for an answer or violates a right that they may or may not be aware of, because the police doesn't actually know a lot of they're supposedly enforcing. But there have been cases where if the district repeatedly violates the same right, then it sets precedent for new legislation to be put in place. So it's important that people know, like, hey, I said this to this officer, he still did it. I told my attorney, and we have 5 people that happened to it, and then this becomes a policy put in place. So like, this has happened a lot in this area. This isn't going to happen anymore.
I think I'm gonna ask that we hold the rest of the questions until the Q&A portion on state police non-cooperation side of things. So currently Vermont State Police have a policy against spending detention when requested by ICE, DHS, or CBP to allow for the detention of those individuals on the basis of their immigration status, and against providing certain information to federal immigration enforcement with limited exceptions. However, when making an arrest, police do fingerprint individuals, which does flag federal authorities due to accessing of the FBI database to record those fingerprints. Some cities in Vermont have also adopted this sort of non-cooperation policy, and some have not. So clarifying who you're interacting with is key. If you're interacting with the Vermont State Police, they should not ask for your immigration status. They have a policy against doing that. However, cities within Vermont who have local city police forces, as well as using the Vermont State Police, vary on whether or not they allow officers to ask for immigration status.
What about the sheriff's department here in Wyndham County? What is their policy?
I believe that the sheriff's department in Wyndham County has the same model policy as the Vermont State Police.
Brattleboro actually has more restrictions on cooperation with ICE. And the Wyndham County Sheriff has follows the fair and impartial policing policy that's statewide, and that still has some loopholes. I think there's someone over there with more information. I don't know whether, yeah, you might want to wait. I think it's.
Is that with more information or with a question?
I guess to point at another issue that deals with how police work because of whether they want to or not, because
So that's sort of what I'm talking about a little bit with this, is that the Vermont State Police specifically have this policy of not cooperating directly with ICE. Again, with certain loopholes, as was pointed out. For example, if there is a criminal investigation underway where part of what is being criminally charged specifically relates to the issue of immigration status, then there is a loophole for divulging that status to federal enforcement by state police. Otherwise, immigration status is neither supposed to be asked nor given to federal authorities, specifically by Vermont State Police. And I believe you said also the Wyndham County Sheriff uses that model policy as well, as do Brattleboro City Police. This is variant around Vermont. For example, I'm in Burlington. Burlington has adopted the model policy that replicates the state policy. We're trying to push them to enact an even more stringent policy. We'll see if that happens or not. And then there are certain cities and counties around Vermont that share more freely than the Vermont State Police do. For example, I believe Rutland. And yeah, I think that's that for now, and we can get back to it in the Q&A if people have additional clarifying questions. So I'll move on to the next slide. All right, sanctuary cities and states. This is like a big buzzword right now. So I think clarifying exactly what that means is important. And so I'll start off with saying, practically, legally, it doesn't mean that much. The term sanctuary city and sanctuary state is mostly a work of art. And it means a place that has given some kind of commitment to broader protections for immigrants than on the federal level. Right, so that can mean so many things. And different cities and states enact those policies in different ways. One way in which Vermont enacts them is through that fair and impartial policing policy that we were just speaking about. So that gives greater protections than states do without having any policy in place on communication between law enforcement and ICE. For cities, that can mean things like enacting a rule that any employee of the city government is not allowed to ask for one's immigration status when they're taking them through a paperwork or a filing, things of that nature. But there's sort of no one definition for what legal policy has to be in place in order for a city or a state to call itself a sanctuary city or sanctuary state. So if you're curious about a place that's calling itself a sanctuary city or state, you should look into specifically what policies they have enacted or are proposing, if any. And does it protect people from enforcement action and deportation? Ish, I would say is the answer. That will depend on the policy that's in place, right? So it could be that the policy that makes a sanctuary city more welcoming is something like the Vermont policy that allows for people to get advanced certifications, advanced working certifications before they have an employment authorization document. And that is really helpful and really wonderful and really welcoming. It doesn't do much against enforcement action or deportation, right? Or it could be something like not cooperating directly with ICE, which of course would be an added barrier against deportation. So that really does depend very specifically on the policy. Right? Yeah.
Just to clarify, at the end of the day, if ICE has a judicial warrant or something, it's the federal government and that trumps any state policy you put in place.
That's accurate. ICE in the workplace. ICE cannot enter anywhere a member of the general public cannot go unless they have a judicial warrant. So going back to the sort of like all important judicial warrant, no other warrants. You want one that has the court across the top, judge's signature. And so that includes many areas that you might see in the workplace, as Liv has outlined: kitchen, staff break rooms, back offices, areas marked staff only, and private. None of those are open to the general public, and therefore they are also not open to ICE unless they have a judicial warrant. That said, if you're on a property that does have, or in a workplace that does have some open areas to the public, any of those areas are free game for any law enforcement authority, ICE, CBP, etc. ICE can try to enter with an administrative warrant, and or they sometimes do, I should say. Can they? They really shouldn't. So much as in if ICE comes to one's home and making sure to ask to see the warrant to see exactly what it looks like, make sure it's judicial, not administrative, same practices apply in a workplace. As an employer, if you're the person being presented with an administrative warrant, you should say this is a private area and you can't enter without a judicial warrant that is signed by a judge. Do you have one on you? If they don't, you can ask them to leave. Additionally, employers don't have to confirm or deny if particular employees work there. So if someone shows up at an employer's place of business, or I guess really anywhere, if someone's speaking to an employer and asks, do you employ X individual? The employer does not have to confirm that, does not have to present the employee to speak with ICE, etc. How can asylum seekers protect themselves? A big one is being informed and understanding rights, which is really hard. This is a really complex system that I went to school for 3 years to learn about and still get confused about sometimes. And most people do not have the benefit of that. So as community members, something that you can help with is connecting with individuals, explaining rights as they understand it, trying to connect them to information, organizations, etc., who can help really explain those rights and drive them home. So that sort of ties into this next bullet point: being educated about their legal process is really important for asylum seekers. Contingency plans in place. I will say, like, all of this, I think you can extend past just how can asylum seekers protect themselves. Like, how can immigrants today in the United States protect themselves? Knowing where immigration papers, passports are, and having a trusted person know as well. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, having copies of those that are kept on one's person at all times, and having originals somewhere safe, is a really good form of self-protection. Being safe with use of technology and being careful what's posted on social media and on what apps are being used is huge. And I think that's like incredibly frustrating to tell someone, like, it's fine if I, Emma, US citizen, am posting this. You, however, may not want to. But that is sort of just reality. An example that I'll offer up is that, as individuals in this room may or may not know, there's a difference in state law versus federal law when it comes to legalization of the use of marijuana. And an individual who lives in a state where marijuana is completely legal, but who is not a United States citizen, if they're going through a federal immigration process, because that's covered under the umbrella of federal law, and marijuana has not been federally legalized, can still be penalized, denied immigration status, etc., for having used marijuana despite doing it within a state where it's completely legal. So how does that translate to social media? I work with a lot of children and a lot of young adults who live in states where marijuana is legalized. I had a 19-year-old in California when I was living and working there who, smoked a picture with his friends, all smoking blunts. And then that was brought to court as an exhibit, as evidence against him in his proceeding. And he, because it is, again, like a vast, confusing, weird system, if it's not one that you operated in every day, had no idea he'd done anything wrong. He was, smoking with a bunch of friends who are all US citizens who have never had to think about this in their lives, didn't know that there were different rules that applied to him because of his immigration status. And that's something that we see a lot. So that's sort of two issues there, the issue between the difference in federal law and state law, but also just in being really careful about what you're posting, because it can end up being presented in court or by U.S. Immigration Service in administrative proceedings. Yes.
If I can interrupt just a second, something a lot of people don't know about, very important to anybody who's undocumented or might be in trouble. If you have a cell phone, if you're going to anything controversial, turn it off. Your cell phone can be tracked. Everybody here today, somebody wanted to, we could all be identified probably as being here because we have your cell phones on, to anybody who's interested.
That's a really good point. It's similar to the idea of never presenting an unlocked cell phone to an authority. Additionally, if you are going to be somewhere, like you said, that could potentially be used against you, turning off your cell phone is a good precautionary measure to take. Absolutely. And then also just having a phone number and essential information memorized. If for some reason you are detained without access to your documents, being able to call someone who can assist you, really, really important. Slide, please. Then how can I support my asylum seeking, I would say, and other immigrant friends and neighbors? Understanding fears and concerns and trying not to compound them. Something that we're seeing a lot of right now, and it's really understandable because it's a scary time, is just total spiraling out about what the next Trump administration could mean for people, which again, very understandable, but when it's not evidence-based and grounded in either policies that we've seen before that we know will arise again or things that are starting to occur, all that does is make people substantially more fearful and substantially less likely to act rationally in frightening situations. Helping to understand rights, as we talked about already, helping with contingency planning for things like children, pets, school, etc. Getting involved with their communities, supporting organizations that support asylum seekers and other immigrants, and legislation that protects asylum seekers and other immigrants. I want to touch in a little bit more depth on point number 3, because I think that's really important. Some specific contingency planning that we're starting to do right now around the issue that I brought up earlier, the young US citizen children being separated from undocumented or underdocumented parents, there's the very real reality is that the deportation of US citizen children is not something that can occur because they are citizens of the United States, right? So deportation is contrary to that. You can't deport someone to a country where they have no status, when they have status in your country. And the way that this often plays out is somewhat horrible, of parents being deported without their children, and those children then ending up in the foster care system. A couple thousand children were lost the last time that this occurred and have not been located since, which is really frightening. And so a way that we are encouraging undocumented and underdocumented parents to try to set up contingency plans for their families is to have what's called a springing guardianship. A springing guardianship is a guardianship that comes into place once an event occurs. The event that would be occurring here would be the detention with the intent of deportation of the parent, in which case that springing guardianship would come into place for their child so that someone they know, a family member, a friend, someone in their community has guardianship over that child so that the child is not going into the foster care system. This is the most reliable way to protect one's family and then hopefully move towards family reunification from there, in terms of, say, trying to get that child access to the area where their parent has been deported, or potentially trying to eventually get that parent back to the United States, depending on a variety of factors. And then it might seem silly, but pets too. I have a parrot, his name is Papaya. I have Papaya because a friend contacted me saying, my neighbor is about to be deported. He's desperately scared about what's going to happen to his pet. He doesn't want it to just go to a shelter. Can you take it? And so now I have Papaya, who's very sweet. And while obviously this solved almost no problems for this individual, peace of mind is really important, and like little bits of peace of mind in otherwise really terrifying situations. So thinking about things like that. Slide. Alrighty. Takeaways. Rhetoric is not law. So something I think that's really important is figuring out what's actually being established in law, and not just that, how it's being established. So like we talked about earlier, things that are just case law can sort of go back and forth, like matter of A, B. Things that are actual, like codified congressional Senate legislation are a lot harder to have flip-flops. So things like the Fourth Amendment's applications to everybody, unlikely to change, would be incredibly difficult to change that. The right to apply for asylum because of a fear of persecution, while how people have the opportunity to apply for asylum might change, that basic right, because of the way it is codified in US law, is unlikely to change. Different immigration statuses carry varying levels of risk, as we've sort of already discussed. The difference between someone who is un or underdocumented, someone who's an asylum seeker, someone who's a refugee, and that there are steps that we can take to try to ensure that those rights are protected. Those include helping with education of people on their rights, letting them know how to enforce their rights on their own, and letting them know what to do if those rights are violated. Hi, Zoom people.
We have Alex Beck from BDCC joining us, and Emma will also be in the panel, as will I from CASP. So we'll move on to our Q&A. I think, Rachel, are you facilitating?
So sorry, I was trying to attend to some text. Can I have a repetition of that question?
Oh, yeah. When you're in your car, does ICE have to have, is it like your home? Does ICE have to have a judicial warrant to search your car, except in the 100-mile zone?
Yeah,
that's how I read.
That's correct. ICE has to have
either a warrant or probable cause to search your car unless you're within 100-mile zone. And so probable cause, a little wishy-washy, as you probably know, that's true both for the police and for ICE. That means there needs to be a reason other than your race, the language that you're speaking in, etc., to ask for a search of your car. That you have probable cause that you have committed some sort of traffic violation, or in the case of ICE and CBP, an immigration-based crime.
Like if you're driving and you've got some workers with you, they stop you because they're suspecting that they don't have papers. They don't have a warrant, and they
would have to have probable cause for that stop if they're outside of the 100-mile zone. And so there would need to be a reason for that stop outside of just, say, the race, the physical appearance of those workers.
So last time, my understanding was a lot of folks were stopped. Last time during the past Trump administration, there were a lot of stops on 89, and the further south you got, essentially outside of that 100-mile zone, there were less. So that's why in Brattleboro we didn't see that kind of action, but in Chittenden County and further north, they absolutely did. And so that's just something that believers trickled down to us, but that enforcement didn't during the last administration.
Yeah, so within the 100-mile border zone, what you'll often see is you'll just see basically blockades and like paper checking checkpoints that are set up. And within that 100-mile border zone, that's okay. ICE has that ability, but once you get outside of it, like I said, you have that sort of added level of protection of either needing a warrant or a probable cause for a stop question.
It's a probable cause, like your headlights out.
So if you're being stopped by the police, that would be the type of probable cause for a police stop. The type of probable cause for an immigration stop, for example, might be like, we are aware of this undocumented individual. We know that they are a 32-year-old male wearing a green jacket, X, Y, and Z, and this person like that description, so that rises to the level of probable cause, whereas just someone's nationality, language, etc. do not.
I have a microphone and just answer this question. So I've seen online mention of these little red cards that people should be ordering piles of and giving out, and I've seen different immigrant justice organizations promoting ordering piles of those. And I'm just curious if you could speak to those. They're like little know your rights things. And I've heard it said, like, if you hold one of those up in a window, that constitutes your understanding of your rights and your reply to them. And, does that work in a car? And can you just speak to those and how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. Red cards are great. They are basically a know your rights card. And what they help with, I don't know that I've seen them as much as being held up in windows. But they provide on them, like, this is what you say or do not say to someone if you're stopped. So sort of like, I believe you asked earlier, like when you're in one of those situations where someone is pressing you, like, how do you remember what to do? How do you try to like affirmatively assert your rights? Those cards help with that. Like, this is what's being asked. This is what you say. This is what's being asked. This is what you say.
Like when I now, like, makes sense.
Yes, I think that's very helpful. My organization does that.
Can the police order you to get out of the car, then arrest you for not doing so?
Wow. So what a good question. Yeah, absolutely. The question was, can the police ask you to get out of your car, and can they arrest you for not doing so? And so if we're talking specifically about the police, the answer is that is exactly the same for an immigrant, for someone who's undocumented, as it is for any U.S. citizen, which is that without reasons for issuing an arrest, without a reason to make you get out of your car. Police are not supposed to ask you to exit your vehicle for something like, say, just a routine traffic stop. Nor can, if the police are asking you to get out of your car for a routine traffic stop and you say no, again, they're not supposed to be able to arrest you for refusing to do that. We've seen in practice that sometimes that request is made anyway, and that sometimes police don't react super well when folks decline to do so. But legally, there is not a difference between anyone who is or is not a citizen of the United States in terms of when a police can ask you to exit a vehicle, when they cannot. In terms of ICE and border protection, similar idea. If there is not a reason, if they don't have probable cause to actively detain you, they should not be asking you to exit your vehicle.
Yeah, so I want to take space and just say that first, like, yeah, this is targeted mostly towards Black and brown people, so just be aware of like of who you are to begin with. Second is that so I'm a DACA out of status recipient, and of course I given my fingerprints to the government. I given all my information to the government. Two questions. First one is, do you know or aware of how ICE can use my information I've given about my family, where I am, to sort of like hunt me down, I guess? And second, does it make sense under the Trump administration to get a DACA status application?
Okay, I'm gonna repeat the question. It was first off, a recognition of those who are going to be most at risk for this type of enforcement, and recognition of the fact that primarily Black and brown individuals will be targeted. That's absolutely accurate. We thought that to be true last time. That's likely to be true this time as well. And then a question around being I think you said out of status DACA recipient, and how information previously provided to the United States government, fingerprints, family information, et cetera, needed for DACA status can be used currently, and if it makes sense to apply for DACA status again. In terms of the first question, say is any information that's already held by the government in terms of addresses, family members, addresses, et cetera. Difficult to retract. The protections that are available for you, for family members, are similar to what was already talked about, where like if someone shows up at your house without a judicial warrant and they say, hey, let's good, we want to speak to you, we know you live here. No, no, come back with a judicial warrant, don't come back at all. We have not seen, I guess, anecdotally, that the government has taken the time to comb back through those applications and pull out individuals' information and the information of their families to start looking for them. I think that one of the things that's often a legal deficit, but sometimes can be helpful, is that would be like that's a very administrative thing to do. And United States Immigration Services is so overwhelmed and backlogged in its administrative functions that I personally believe it's unlikely that they're going to take people off of the already backlogged functions to start combing through old information to look for people. That seems something that there's not really personnel or resources to do, which in this case is quite beneficial. But again, were that to happen, what you would do is sort of invoke the same a judicial warrant is needed for you to come in to search, to speak to us, etc. And in terms of applying for renewed DACA status, Transparently, most places are not assisting with that right now because DACA status is on indefinite hiatus. So while you can put in an application, it is unlikely that it will ever be reviewed. Especially because we expect the Trump administration to, if they are able to, end the program, which is a pretty awful reality, but is unfortunately where we are right now.
Emma, I know we have some questions on Zoom. And go ahead.
I just want to hand the mic to Alex real quick because we spent a lot on the humanitarian portion, which is obviously which is obviously extremely important. But Alex can also speak a lot to the impact this will have on our community and our workforce.
Great, thank you. So first and foremost, I'll say that nothing I say represents the positions of my employer. I'm speaking based on my own experiences. And I'll say I'm really proud to work for an economic development organization that has the wherewithal to support an organization like CASP. So I'm not, the organization, helps sponsor this event. I'm here, saying my own personal beliefs, but, one of the good things about my role in focusing on immigrant inclusion in the economy is that almost every single economist or labor market economist in the last 5 years have said immigration is good for the economy. So if you are hearing that is not the case, you're not talking to someone who actually works or cares much for the economy. What I'll say is that, and someone mentioned earlier, like, would it make sense for the government to? And I think that's a line of thinking we need to throw out. Because mass deportations would be more detrimental to the economy than or tariff import-export policies. And both of these things are being entertained by the incoming administration. So which is frightening to say because in theory, the conservatives are supposed to be more pro-economy. So we're really, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges generally, but also for our employers here in Southern Vermont explicitly. And I'll give a shout out to my colleague Amir, who works for the BDCC. He is, I helped design that initial training of employers and understanding the paperwork. And unfortunately, Amir is the person who's really supporting the employers on compliance. And so every time something changes with work reauthorization, with policy, there's a new kind of immigrant, which, the Haitian Cuban program, temporary protected status, that's a new kind of immigrant. Our Afghan community members, this humanitarian parolee. The government likes to put people in boxes, and it is terrible as an employer to understand how best to bring desperately needed workers into the company. And so, something I believe the automatic extension period of work authorization was just extended, right? So we get a letter from some archaic government body saying, hey, if your work permit expires, but you've asked for it to be renewed, you have like 500 days, 590 before it's out of compliance. Try telling that to the lumberyards, right? And so I'll say that is not only technically complicated, which is a real barrier to folks accessing economic opportunity, but it's part of the fear and uncertainty is that if employers see this complicated and potentially it's a liability, right? I think, to employ someone without documentation, although employers don't often fall victim to any enforcement agency, it's almost always the employees. There's that fear. And HR's folks, their number one responsibility is to protect the organization. So even companies who are desperate for labor, who are welcoming in terms of their culture and their beliefs, the paperwork is challenging. And so that is something where, I believe, I believe if our country took supporting our economy seriously, would reform a lot of specifically asylee process. Because the hardest client for me to serve is someone who's here, maybe highly educated, hard worker, and they have to wait a year until they're allowed to do that. And so, I mean, it is, maybe a quintessentially American thing to expect self-sufficiency and provide someone none of the tools and resources to do so. We learned that, and there have been some good changes that have come with our partnership with CASP. So, not having a work permit means you're not eligible for Department of Labor funds. And per the policy of Vermont, a lot of education funds, you needed to be a resident in Vermont for over a year. Because our legislators were thinking of, that dastardly New Hampshire person coming over the border to access our somewhat generous higher education funds. And so they have to be a Vermont resident for a year, and they excluded many, many, many people. And so as we started working with CASP and its asylees who, like someone who's an expert in finance, all they needed to do was learn the American version of QuickBooks. We had to find, there's ample free money for almost everyone except an asylee. So luckily, we worked with VSAC and they changed that statewide. So the Vermont Student Assistance Corporation has a lot of good grant funds. That didn't help that asylum seeker, right? That took a year to do, and this person was stuck. And so luckily, I think it was our incredible Rotary Club paid for the class for that person to do it. But that was, I wouldn't say a waste of money, but those were, our tax dollars went to our state and were withheld from that individual because of their status. That's the way, God bless the Rotary. It's not their job to pay for that kind of stuff. That's why we pay our taxes, in my opinion. And so there are the day-to-day, the fears and uncertainties, but there's also real structural implications that it has on our workforce. And when a few years ago, when Florida and Texas were sending the buses of folks in the plane to Martha's Vineyard, I had employers come to me and say, "Where's our bus? If we had a place that housed these people, we would love to welcome them to our community, into our workplace." And so there is a big gap, and that's what we're seeing is that, if you bring 10,000 people in your community and tell them they can't work, that's a crisis. And that's the crisis that a lot of American communities are facing. If you let these folks work, it would not be a crisis. It would be an incredible boon to any rural community like it has been to ours, but also really help the individuals who need, that self-sufficiency. So that's my big spiel on the employer side of things. And I'm, happy to answer questions if you have them on.
I just want to say for questions, I have about 4 people in here.
Question from our participants on Zoom. I thought the acceptance of an I-589 shows that you are legally in the country until your hearing, and that is supposed to be carried with you.
That's correct. While the acceptance of an I-589 does not provide a protective status against, say, detention during the pendency of proceedings, it does prevent detention and deportation. So a copy of it should always be carried with you, and an original should be preserved somewhere safe.
Community guardianship work for the non-U.S. citizen child of an asylum-seeking couple if both parents were to be deported without their child.
Unlikely in that situation that the family would not be deported as a unit. I would actually recommend against doing that because that becomes likely to then be a complication in having the family leave the country together as a unit.
If an asylum case is denied, is the person immediately at risk of deportation? Should they appeal immediately?
Excellent question. It's something that I usually try to go through. I didn't think to go through today. Once if your asylum is denied, there are 2 processes. I'll start with this, affirmative and defensive processes. So if you have not had a court proceeding started on the basis of your immigration status, then you're in an affirmative process. If you apply affirmatively, the first part of your process is an asylum office interview. And So that's number one. If you have a defensive process, you start immediately in the courts. If you are denied through the affirmative process, you then have the opportunity to start the defensive process. So part one, if you're already within the defensive process and you are denied at the court level, you have 30 days during which to appeal to the Board of Immigration Appeals. You will have a removal order set at the when your asylum application is denied during sort of your first round of court. But that will not be enacted on immediately because you do have those 30 days to appeal. If you do not appeal within those 30 days, you will have a permanent removal order put into place. You'll have to surrender yourself within 90 days for removal country. If you are denied on Board of Immigration appeal, you have a second chance to appeal. Basically, there's like a two-part appeal process. And also sometimes, depending on whether or not there's like a novel issue of law at play, etc., you can also appeal up to the state Supreme Court. That's a little more rare, it's a little more variant, but it can happen. But basically, once you've exhausted 2 rounds of appeals, if you're denied at each turn, then you will have a final order of deportation and 90 days during which to surrender yourself for removal.
I was confused about administrative warrants. One still doesn't have to let them in or answer questions in a home, ? If so, what does an administrative warrant allow?
That's correct. So it depends a little bit on what the administrative warrant looks like. But at its basis, an administrative warrant is basically a charging document. So it's mostly telling you that you may have to appear in court, and does not allow for something like a search or a seizure. Whereas a judicial warrant is within our criminal law system, and so allows for search and potential seizure, depending on the specificity of the warrant.
I think we'll move back to room questions and then back.
We're going back to room questions and then back to Zoom in a bit.
My question is, what are the federal and Vermont state laws about filming a police officer or ICE?
Do it, but I'm pretty sure that it's allowable. Can't 100%, but I'm nearly positive that that is allowed.
And would you recommend that happen if ICE or the police are?
Yeah, although they might get this. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I would say that all of this, Vermont and elsewhere is dependent on whether or not it's a 1-party consent or 2-party consent state. If you are in a 2-party consent state for recording, I'm just gonna flag this right now. Don't record ICE or the police, because that can be used against you as a violation of law if those individuals have not consented to also being recorded. However, I believe that Vermont is a 1-party consent state, which means that a random individual outside of the interaction should not be recording the interaction, because then nobody within the interaction has consented to the recording of it. But if I am a person interacting with Liv and I want to record because I'm 1 party in the interaction, I'm consenting to the recording.
How hard it is for local employers to deal with all the issues. That's particularly true of smaller employers. What type of service can they reach out to you for? Is there a hotline? Is there a person who will come in and fill out the paperwork?
Yeah, so there's two different sides to that question. One is it's the answer is yes, absolutely. So on our website, and this is part of our Welcoming Communities initiative. So you can go to welcomingcommunitiesvt.com and watch some old trainings that we call welcoming workplaces. And so these have been trainings we brought folks from like DRM and other lawyers to say, like, kick it off, like, here is what discrimination in the workplace based on status looks like, and here's how not to do it. Like, this is the kind of paperwork that these folks will have. You may not ask for a passport, you may not ask for specific documentation. And so we provide those trainings. There's also coming up here in this space on January 30th, another training that we're calling Expander Talent Options. Because any employer who is not looking at the entire community as a source, both for labor and for community, is not doing their best, right? So we are not just saying, hey, these folks are employable. We're saying, and here's how you can support them in the workplace beyond the paperwork. But I think that's something that if a company wants to hire someone, particularly from the immigrant community, often it's as a group, but yes, we help with onboarding. That is, American can say how much time he spent, it's part of that onboarding is we are both educating immigrants on the American workplace and HR folks on that process. And it's silly stuff. Like if you don't need a social security number, but a social security number is how we do our taxes. And that's something I wanted to mention is that like the liability of paying someone under the table is real, particularly for asylum seekers. I've had really well-meaning people saying, hey, like, can't I just pay this person under the table? And, none of us will get thrown in jail for tax evasion, but someone would absolutely be deported for tax evasion. And that's the unfair reality. And so the payroll specialist will say, what do I do without a social security number? It's actually not that hard. You punch in zeros, you withhold their taxes, and then when they get a social security number, you fill it in and they pay their taxes. And so that is where fear really, and the complexity of it really poses a challenge, much more so than is it possible and do people want to do it, right? And so that's where, and that stuff we've had to learn as we go. When we went to go help support the first person who didn't have a social security number, as an organization and as a group of professionals, we learned that, right? And so then communicating the employers and providing those training. So the short answer is yes. And there are still some companies who are like, oh, can't do it. Or if you have, or businesses aren't set up that way. So if you have a contract with the Department of Defense and you're building a widget, if there is not a sealed door with a security thing in between that location where that widget is being made and the rest of the company, by default, they may not even be able to employ foreign nationals. Right. And so if there was a key card door in between those two parts of the facility, then that company could absolutely ensure that they're following all the federal law. And so these are things that states with not a lot of immigration in the past have trouble with. Right. Our facilities have been built. Right. And so to go to retroactively build a workplace that can adhere to some really convoluted legal blah isn't what a company or a small business will do here. And so that's and so we've seen employers saying we're desperate for labor, we love to. We can't. The paperwork or the legal implications of employing work eligible folks is just not a possibility. And I don't begrudge those employers, right? There are going to be prejudiced employers in every country or every city and every town in the country, right? But the real challenge is for the folks here, particularly who want to be welcoming. And that's not it. It's not just vibes. It's not just, how you feel. It's a logistical and operational challenge for our small business.
We had someone with their hand raised in this section.
Hi, thank you. This is a lot of really good information, but I'm finding it there's a lot of detail and a lot of legal concepts. And as a native English speaker, I'm finding it hard to follow. So I'm wondering, are you putting any effort and resources into getting this information translated? Some of these handouts, this information seems like it's a little accessible to your target audience.
Yeah, so this was specifically intended for volunteers, people in the community who are interested. We're also sending out this information. Most of our clients speak Spanish. BCBC setting it up in Tigrinya and Dari, I believe. And a lot of this information is also available through like NIJC, et cetera. But yes, we will be educating our clients separately. It just didn't really make sense to have sort of a double format.
The Vermont Asylum Assistance Project, which is a group that I work with, also has a resource library on our website, www.vaap.org. If you go to the resources area, we have a lot of this information, and our website can automatically translate into Spanish, French, Dari, and Pashto, and we're working on increasing the number of languages that we provide translation in as well.
So one thing I'll hazard that I've heard elsewhere, and this is interesting coming from me, but you cannot rely on Google and AI to answer these questions effectively. And so that's something that when you Google something, the AI gives you the best answer. And I've heard, and part of national immigrant inclusion organizations and networks that I get to learn from, and there have been explicit instances of bad case law being cited. And so in these instances, like going to the VAAP website is going to be a lot more reliable than Googling it, which normally Google is actually pretty good, but there are really explicit cases. And like AI is bad about law in general. And so I hate that it's weird to put it out there, but now that all of your search engines use the same AI as ChatGPT for the most part, that's just a flag I want to raise that we've seen elsewhere.
That's a really great flag. Thank you for pointing that out. Absolutely. I've been like somewhat horrified as an immigration practitioner. Well, go and type in like an answer to a question just to sort of see how AI answers it. And we'll be like, oh, you just made up a name. That's not even a case. Okay, great. So definitely trying to direct folks to specific resources. If you know anyone who has questions, it's great. The NIGC, National Immigrant Justice Coalition, is a great one. Vermont Asylum Assistance Project as well. And then also, I mean, the one thing that I think can be useful using AI, ChatGPT, et cetera, if you wish to, is to type in, where can I go for resources? And a resource list will be provided. And usually getting information from that list is quite reliable, even though you don't want to just ask sort of open-ended questions.
So Emma, this has been so interesting and valuable, and I really appreciate it very much. And I'm thinking of the police. And just as you said, Alex, there's some who may be prejudiced, but there are an awful lot of really fine people within the force, right? So I am wondering, for their consciousness, do you or someone else from VAAP go and actually speak with the police force, go to their barracks and talk with them so that they're not in a vulnerable position as to knowing whether they can ask this or not, or if someone says, no, you can't have my purse, do they understand everything that we've just gotten a glimmer of?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And the answer to that is that in building out the various fair and impartial policing standards, those were done largely in collaboration with and cooperation with organizations like the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project, like Migrant Justice. So those conversations have been had with police officers in the on the state level and in the cities that have wanted to apply those sort of fair and impartial policing guidelines. And also that, and this varies a little bit, again, city to city, town to town, but I know in Burlington, for example, there is someone on staff within the police department who is employed like by city funding that's not actually police department funding to sort of keep them a little more impartial, who is very familiar with the model policy, with immigration law broadly, who can offer like advice and guidance to officers if they are confused about sort of what this means for them practically, even though they've already had sort of maybe a couple of trainings and stuff on that to do more specific sort of one-on-one questions. And if cities are looking for a model for that, I really suggest looking at that model. I think that's really valuable.
I don't know how we're doing on time. We have three more questions on the floor. I don't know if we can pass it to Zoom after those 2, 3. So
Yeah, so one of the question is, as a out of DACA recipient status, I don't have a work permit anymore, but I have social. What is the risk of me continuing to use that social to get labor and pay taxes? And second, and some jobs then allow me to work if I have a social, even though I don't have a work permit.
I'm going to remind everyone, I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer. I'm going to answer this rhetorically. My understanding is that if you have a social security number, you can create a business and pay taxes, and that business is what will receive money. And that is an instance. So the short answer is working without work authorization is a liability and a risk. That said, I am familiar with actually some, like it's a construction and independent contractors who have in some ways exploited the same loopholes that the more nefarious employers of underdocumented folks also take advantage of. So essentially, if you have a social security number, you can become an independent contractor or start an LLC, and then that is how you would generate income. Is that you would not be being paid as an individual. It would be your business, and if your business is paying taxes, that is, I guess, the affirmative way of saying the government would have no reason to find you. From an employment perspective, it's all about taxes. If you're working, they just want your income tax. That's generally the government's position from that perspective. And if you're under or undocumented, you're probably not doing that because you have no mechanism to. So that's my experience, is that independent contractors or independent businesses don't have status. And so that may be a way to circumvent that challenge.
I'm gonna flag from a legal perspective that's largely good. We look largely great. One safeguard that I personally recommend putting in place is that if you're going to become an LLC, having an individual on the books as working for you as an employee who does have either a work authorization document or some form of status that allows them to work, so that if you're, say, if the question comes up, well, how could you possibly not be working if you're running your own business? You can say, I just own the business. The employee does the work. That is one way to sort of legitimize that a little bit more and offer yourself like an extra layer of protection. And I'm also I'm happy to have like a more specific one-on-one discussion if you want. Since I know we are very tight on time.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like that.
Okay.
You have 6 questions on Zoom, and I think I really appreciate the people who hung in there online, and all of you as well, but we would like to let those folks answer their questions. So please stay if you can, and as quick as we can.
We see if this technology works. Martha, can you answer your question?
Yeah, I hope this, thank you so much for this really, really helpful session. And I hope this is actually a quick question to answer. But for folks who don't speak English, and I hear you saying that some of these items may be translated into documents that I'm certainly working with several who can't read those documents, even if they're in a language they speak. What can people do when they're stopped if they don't speak English? Can they they probably can't expect translation from the police or maybe ICE, but are they, if they can make like one call, do they need to call the translator immediately, or how does that work? That's the piece I'm trying to, how do they even have access to being able to have the conversations or exercising their rights if they can't speak?
Yeah, so you do have a right to know like why you're being stopped, what you're being stopped for. So there actually is some expectation that law enforcement should be providing information in someone's known language. An example of that would be if the police read someone their Miranda warnings in English and say they've been Mirandized. No, they haven't. Because part of the law is not just communicating to someone sort of what's happening, what their rights are, et cetera, but communicating it to them and them affirmatively understanding it. In terms of documents, I always suggest like going over those with an attorney or an interpreter or a translator, because like you said, even in someone's native language, those documents can be incredibly confusing. But in terms of
Can I just jump?
discussion, yeah.
So I'm really talking about like when they're stopped or at the minute that they're, that someone is trying to talk to them. Can they just call a translator? Because they're not going to show up with an ability to speak in Pashto, right? They're just not. And so somehow at the beginning of that interaction, can they pick up the phone and call a friend? Can they call a translator? Do they lose their ability to call their lawyer? I'm just like that really immediate interaction.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so again, what should be happening is they should be able to request that the person who is stopping them communicate with them in their native language or provide communication in their native language. If that is not occurring, calling someone is hopefully an option. I do just want to flag that we do know that sometimes there are dangers associated with doing things that someone who has pulled you over, who has stopped you, has not like affirmatively instructed you to do. So I would definitely suggest calling an interpreter if you're in contact with DVP or with ICE, with someone from the immigration enforcement side of things. I do think that those gets a little bit trickier, potentially more risky if it's a police officer, particularly for individuals of color who are often disproportionately targeted by police violence for things that are seen as basic non-compliance, when actually it's something just as simple as trying to understand what's being asked of them. And in that case, yeah, and in that case, I would just, if it's police specifically, I would encourage like repeatedly asking for the language in which an individual is a native speaker.
When authorities violate the law, for instance, by giving illegal commands to exit a car, what should we do?
Report it. The short answer is that, like, yes, that is a violation. It's still something that happens all the time. So just reporting those violations is incredibly important, because the more they're reported, the more documented, the more likely it is that a protection will be in place to stop that from happening in the future. Again, I think that really depends. And I would go back to what I was just saying about sort of the difference in potential danger between Border Patrol, ICE, and law enforcement. If you feel that you are, say, at physical risk from a police stop, I would recommend complying and reporting. If you feel that you are not at physical risk from ICE, from CBP, etc., I would recommend continuing to affirmatively assert your rights.
Just something I'll add as not a lawyer. You know, Thoreau wrote a pretty great piece on civil disobedience, and I think as like privileged folks, that's the choice. Is that what does compliance mean? What does it not mean? And you can be right and still thrown in jail because this is the kind of country we live in. So that is the choice. And so I think that's you know, you can't give a good legal response to that, and neither can I, of course, but I think that's our role as folks of more privilege in this power dynamic, is to see what we will do. And it's a terrifying thought. And I think it also goes to the question of what happens when we get stopped. Yeah, I think it's a time of courage, if nothing else.
I'll piggyback on that briefly. I think we're all well aware that this is, I don't want to say theoretical, but like a best practice know your rights thing. We're aware that not all law enforcement officials follow the conscripted practice, and that you have to assess the situation as it comes. If you're faced with someone who you think that, you know, doing best practice might put you in harm's way, then yeah, you might have to get out of the car or, you know, accept unlawfulness.
Do you know anything about the future of the parole program for Cubans?
Yeah, as of now, the parole program for Cubans is on hiatus and is unfortunately likely to be terminated. So those who currently have parole through that program are likely to be able to keep that status through the end of whatever their assigned date was. But once you hit that deadline, it's very unlikely that you'll be able to apply to have that parole extended.
And that includes Nicaraguans, Haitians, and Venezuelans as well.
Besides Venezuelans,
Nicaraguans, Haitians, and Venezuelans.
Does each person or family we work with have a number to call if immediate help is needed with the situations we're addressing? And does CASP have copies of their vital documents?
So like insofar as specifically CASP clients, or like who's asking this question, that would probably answer better.
I think it's broader.
I mean, if it is a CASP client, yes, we have copies of all the right documents, and they would be able to call with the case managers. If it is a random individual, there are rapid response networks, and we can definitely provide a list of rapid response networks so they could call and get immediate response from.
Must interpreters be court certified, or can family members act as translators or interpreters?
Excellent question. Largely and mostly, family members, friends, community volunteers can act as interpreters or translators. There are specific instances where there are documents that are being filled out where you need to sign certificates of service. And in those cases, it is recommended that the person certifying that document be fluent in both languages rather than, you know some of each language. So to things like translating someone's identity document before filing it. You're going to want someone who can affirmatively fill out that certificate of service, but that still does not have to be someone who's court appointed. Courts will generally, because they are supposed to, have someone who can translate during the pendency of court proceedings. I would recommend that you use that interpreter, but that you also have someone present in the courtroom who knows when that interpreter is messing up. Because I've had some like rather egregious translation errors that have sometimes impacted my clients' cases, but I've been able to pull them out of the record and point them out. And yeah, I think that's.
Yes, I could, and that's also a double-edged sword, because with USCIS and court proceedings, when you submit a document that needs to be translated into English, there are no requirements for the certification of that translator. So in a sense, you know, say you know a really great translator, you don't have certification, and it's an affordable option, that's great. But say you just hire someone who's like, yeah, I can translate that, and you have no idea if it's correct. They don't require certification, so you don't know what's going in. So it's sort of a double-edged sword in that way. And also, I second you on court interpreters not relevant. Yeah, it's also worth pointing out that while you do have a right to have an interpreter in court, if you're going through an affirmative process, if you're going through an asylum office or U.S. Immigration Services, they have stopped their policy of providing interpreters. You have to bring your own, which is a kind of infuriating barrier, especially when the agency that has the money is not being made to pay the money to provide the services. But that's where we are. So if you are going through an affirmative process, you are going to need to bring them.
So, I'm sure that there are more questions out there, and we got all the ones on Zoom. But wow, I have to say, I didn't know exactly what to expect this morning, both in terms of what things people would be concerned about. I have learned a lot. Thank you, Emma, Alex, Liz. And I just urge all of you to stay connected. One of the reasons I wanted to wear name tags is because I want to know who this community is that is here to support the asylum seekers and other vulnerable communities. If you didn't have a chance to sign in the back, Barb, we still have, and we have some great handouts that if you arrived early, you might not have seen them. Particularly with some ideas about how you can volunteer with CASP. And we would be delighted to hear from you. We will send out information from this morning to everyone who is registered. And I know some of you may not have registered in the official way, but I think we've got all the email addresses at this point, especially if you fill out that. Judy.
I want to thank you for putting this together. It's incredibly informative, and every point you made raised about 5 more questions for all of us. And I hope that you can find the time to do a follow-up in 3 months when we know more of what the landscape is going to look like. That would be helpful. And thank you so much for all the work you did with this together.